In this video, I kind of want to just give you a seasonal rundown of bass fishing. And we're going to talk not only about the different stages that bass go through as far as pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, summer, fall, all that kind of stuff, but I'm also going to give you one technique per each phase that the bass go through that I know has worked very well for me, and I think that it will work for you as well. I'm also going to talk about where I like to fish that technique and the equipment that I like to fish it on. Now, before we get into all that, this video is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing, and right now is the month of December. We have about 2 more weeks left in December, and so I am running a big sale right now on the website. A lot of items are 20% off, and a few items are even 30% off. Also, anyone who buys right now in the month of December is going to be automatically put into a contest to win one of 4 different prizes. So I'm going to be giving away 2 one-of-a-kind bass hats. It's kind of like the hat that I'm wearing right now with a wooden bass badge, but they're colors that I've only produced one of. Also, I'm going to be giving away a brand new Arc Tharp Series grinder rod, which is a phenomenal crankbait rod. I have like 3 or 4 of those. Absolutely love them. Also going to be giving away an Arc Gravity 7 reel. So anyways, I will leave links down below in the description. Shopping at Finn Fishing is truly the best way to help support this channel. I greatly appreciate all of you who have done so. All right, let's go through this seasonal run through. Now, this was actually a question that I got asked by an angler, or I'm assuming in the comments of a video a couple of videos ago. So anyways, let's just go through them. And we're gonna start actually with the pre-spawn. And the pre-spawn to me is one of my absolute favorite times of the year to fish. Typically, you will see a lot of pre-spawn water temperatures kind of between like 48 degrees and about 60 degrees. So to me, this is gonna hit, this is gonna hit a little bit differently throughout. This is gonna hit at different times of the year, depending on where you live in the country. You know, for some of you guys who live down in Florida, you may be experiencing right now even pre-spawn type stuff going on. If you live up in the northern part of the country like myself, we're really getting into winter right now. So anyways, I'm gonna give you my favorite technique during the pre-spawn, which is a chatterbait. A chatterbait by far is a great lure throughout the entire year, but during the pre-spawn, I have always thought that bass really like something with rattles. I think to me, and this is just kind of like a theory, but I feel like every time you have a winter that like no matter where you live in the country, there's a lot of fishermen who kind of stop fishing. You know, really kind of late fall into winter, there's a lot of anglers who are preoccupied with hunting, watching football, whatever it may be. And these lakes during that time frame really kind of go through what I think is like an adjustment period, especially in those states where you have ice that happens. I feel like a lot of these fish that go through this, you know, a number of months with a lot less pressure, they kind of just almost get back to normal, I guess, if that makes sense. They get back to a state where they tend to be a little bit more aggressive. Now, also in the pre-spawn, you do have fish that tend to be a little bit more aggressive anyways, because they are getting ready for the spawn. And so, especially male bass, you know, male bass, even, you know, a lot of times we think about male bass, we think about smaller fish, which they tend to be the smaller fish of the bass species. The male tends to be smaller, but not always. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, a 10-pound smallmouth was caught out of Lake Erie, the biggest smallmouth I've ever heard of out of Lake Erie, and it was actually a male. But with that being said, male bass will actually guard a nest for, you know, and guard fry for like several weeks at times. And during that time frame, while they're guarding the nest, while they are guarding the fry, they are not actively eating. Okay, so bass know that, and so therefore the pre-spawn is a great time where you can throw fast-moving baits that have a lot of vibration, a lot of rattles, and catch a lot of fish. And to me, the best bait that I throw is a chatterbait. And one of the reasons is that it works in kind of the most situations that I can think about. Whether you're fishing in super muddy water, super clear water, whether you're fishing, most of the time this time of the year, it's fairly shallow, but you can fish chatterbaits fairly deep as well. And you can fish green pumpkin chatterbaits to mimic bluegill, white chatterbaits to mimic shad, gold chatterbaits to mimic shiners. You know, it's just a really good bait during the pre-spawn. Now, equipment-wise, what I like with a chatterbait, I use the exact same equipment throughout the entire year. So personally, I use an Arc Tharp Series B-Hitte rod, which is a 7-foot 4-inch medium heavy power, and it is a moderate action rod. It's actually a composite rod, so it's half fiberglass and half graphite. So to me, over the years, I've done a lot of testing on different rods with chatterbaits. That is by far the best rod that I know. And I will leave this stuff linked down below in the description so you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. As far as the chatterbait line goes, I always use 20-pound fluorocarbon with that particular situation. Also, I like to have like a 7, something in the 7 gear ratio, 7.3 to 1, 7.5 to 1, you know, depending on what brand you use, this can be a little bit all over the place. And the reason that I like a 7, you can get away with an 8 gear ratio reel, but you tend to obviously bring that bait a little bit faster through the water column, which is going to give you some lift. And so it's a little bit harder to fish it in a little bit deeper water. And when I say a little bit deeper water, sometimes I will fish a chatterbait around grass clumps outside of spawning areas that I know bass are staging on before they go up to spawn. And I like to fish that bait a little bit deeper, like in 8 foot of water, 9 foot of water, 10 foot of water. And so stepping down to that 7 gear ratio really, to me, allows you to be able to fish it a little bit deeper while also being effective up shallow, where I think that if you're fishing an 8, it just gets to be a little bit harder in deeper water. But it's not a huge deal. If you have an 8 already on your chatterbait rod, just go with it. You can make it work. Now, when I talk about fishing a chatterbait in the pre-spawn, I'm gonna fish it absolutely everywhere. And a lot of times this is cover oriented. So, and a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm focusing in and around main spawning areas. And so, like I said, I'm gonna look at a map and I'm gonna think of where bass are gonna spawn. A lot of times these can be north kind of coves, northern coves and pockets that are on the north side of a lake. You know, that's where the sun is going to hit. So any type of cover or structure that is out from those areas can be a great place to catch bass. Also, any type of visible cover you can see in those pockets, docks, stumps, laydowns, those are all great places to catch bass on a chatterbait in the pre-spawn. So you can fish it a little bit of everywhere. It is by far one of my favorite baits. All right, let's move on to the spawn. So depending on where you live in the country, again, this is going to hit at different times. The big thing about the spawn is it happens a lot quicker up in the northern part of the country than it happens in the southern part of the country. Up north, there is a small time frame where it seems like most bass are going to spawn in like a 2-3 week time frame. And I've seen this in a number of different lakes. They might spawn upwards of a month up in the north, but down south, there is a lot larger time frame. You will have bass that are on beds and spawning, I mean, from a lot of times January through May in the south at times. It just kind of depends on the weather. And so up in the north, it happens a lot quicker. But no matter what, when it happens, typically this is kind of between that like 60 and 73, 74 degree water temperatures. Really between 60 and 70 is the time frame where you're going to see a lot of bass spawning. Now, if bass are in the spawning process, one of the baits that I use a lot if I am visibly trying to catch them is a Texas rig. But even if I am not visibly seeing them, which just happens more times than not, if you have a lot of fish that are up shallow and spawning, you may be flipping your bait into grass, into a laydown, even right next to a dock, and you can catch a lot of these fish that you cannot see but that are on beds with a Texas rig. So to me, a Texas rig bait is by far the best one that I pick up when I think the bass are spawning. And a lot of times I'm going to pitch it into an area and I'm going to let it sit there. Because if you've ever watched, you know, I was very fortunate to have a pond growing up in my backyard. And so I was weird and I would just sit on the bank and watch fish for like hours on end at times while they were spawning. And sometimes I would try to catch them. Sometimes I would just sit there and see what they did. Like I just really enjoyed that. But anyways, if you ever watch a bass, and I would also experiment a lot with baits during this, but what I've seen in ponds applies to bass in big lakes and in rivers as well, is that bass, a lot of times, if you flip a bait up onto a bed and just let it sit there, Sometimes the bass are gonna come over to it right away, and sometimes they know that it's there and they just kind of do this easing up process where they get right up close to it, they get closer and closer and closer, and sometimes your bait, you're not moving it, but because of the natural currents in the water or even the fins of the bass as they kind of back up, will make that bait kind of flip over on its own. And when that happens, you will see bass suck it up at times. So anytime that I'm fishing and I think the bass are spawning, whether I can see them or not, I like to flip into an area where I think they're spawning and just let that bait sit there for like 30 seconds. Sometimes I'm gonna just barely move it a little bit and see if a bass doesn't pick it up. I've told this story a ton before, but a number of years ago, I was fishing a Bassmaster Open down on Lake Toho. And I got whooped by a co-angler behind me who was just able to fish a lot slower than I could. And once I caught on to what he was doing, and we were obviously talking, you know, like we figured out these fish were on beds and all you had to do was flip into these holes in the lily pads and let your bait sit there. And it was a really cool experience. Like I love any way that you learn out there when it comes to bass fishing, even if it means you're getting whooped by someone. So a Texas rig is definitely something that I like. Now, when it comes to the tackle of a Texas rig, this is going to directly correlate to the cover that I'm fishing. You know, if I am fishing in lily pads, really any type of grass situation, a lot of times I'm going to use braided line because bass don't see braid quite as well when you're fishing around a lot of vegetation. And a lot of times you actually, especially if you're fishing for big fish, a lot of times it is so easy for those fish to get wrapped up in the grass. And so I like to have that braid to be able to rip that bait or rip that fish out of the cover while kind of chewing down or mowing down that grass. So I like braid. This could be anywhere from 40 to 60 pound test. Usually I'm gonna use a 7-foot rod, like a 7-foot 6-inch rod in that situation. I tend to like a little bit lighter power rods when I'm using straight braid because I set the hook hard. I know that I'm gonna get plenty of hook into that fish, but I like to use a little bit softer rod so that I don't absolutely like bend out my hook, make massive hooks, make massive hook marks in that fish. And so typically the Texas rig that I fish the most is either a, soft plastic that I fish the most. It's either a tube style bait. I really like a 4.5-inch tube with like a 3/8 ounce weight. That's probably my go-to. Also a beaver style bait for me. I love the Missile Baits D-Bomb. And in that situation, I'm gonna use usually a 5/0 hook on both of those, but the hook is a little bit different for both of those. Now, if I'm fishing around more wood cover or a little bit more open water, even open grass situations where it's not really thick, I will use like a 20-pound fluorocarbon a lot of times because typically bass are going to be pretty close to something when they spawn, whether that's a stump, whether that's a lay down. Usually they like to have a little bit of protection. So they're gonna be pretty close to something and you're really just trying to tick that fish off anyways. But anyways, that's kind of what I go with as far as my Texas rig, and it is a great setup. All right, I got a computer here that just went to sleep while I'm talking, so I'm gonna pull up because I actually made a list for you guys. Okay, so let's go on to post spawn. So obviously this is after the bass spawn, post spawn. So typically you're going to see a lot of water temps between about 70 degrees and I would say like 80 degrees. This is kind of, to me, the more immediate post spawn. Now, by far the bait that I use the most in the post spawn, that direct post spawn, before I really think that the bass are really getting out to like main lake summertime stuff, is a topwater bait. I will throw a topwater bait all over the place. Now, the one that I fish the most is probably like a spook style bait, a walking bait. And there's a number of them that are really good out there on the market. You know, I love a Strike King Sexy Dog. It's a fairly inexpensive bait that you can find a little bit everywhere. And again, I will leave some links down below in the description. But it does seem like top waters in general get bit this time of the year. So if baits like, for example, maybe you're fishing around a lot of grass, maybe a frog or a horny toad might work a little bit better. or maybe you're fishing around, more muddy water that it has a lot of wood cover in it. In that situation, then maybe a buzz bait might work a little bit better. I think in general, post spawn though is a great time to fish top waters. Now, like I said, with the fisheries that I fish, most of the time this is going to be a spook style bait, but it just depends on where you are fishing and the conditions, the cover that you are fishing. But a spook is a great bait. Top waters are a great bait. Now, when it comes to where I like to fish them, one, I'm going to kind of look in almost kind of the reverse. So you have fish that, in the pre-spawn we're staging on areas before they go up to spawn. And now you're gonna have fish that are spawning and they're done, and they kind of sometimes go back to those exact same staging areas. So it might be a random grass clump out in front of a bay or whatever it may be. Or it may be a subtle point, like a secondary point out in front of these bays. And I'm just gonna cast that top water out there. A lot of times I am simply trying to cover a lot of water this time of the year. You will find some really good post-spawn groups of fish at times where they are schooled up, maybe on a certain point, a secondary point, maybe on a random piece of cover, whatever it may be. And a top water is definitely the ones that I use a lot. Now, I also will use a top water just around shallow water. When you have bass that spawn, one, you're always gonna have the males are gonna stick around because they're guarding fry. So sometimes those males, if you wanna catch them, will fall victim to the top water. Also, you're gonna have female bass that stay up shallow to take advantage of the bluegill spawn that typically kind of kicks off around this time of the year during the post spawn. And one of the best baits to use around bluegill beds is some sort of topwater bait. So really, I pick up a topwater a ton in the post spawn, and I'm gonna fish it a little bit of everywhere. Now, as far as a spook goes, when it comes to spook, I like a rod that's made by Arc. It's an Invoker Pro Series rod, and it is actually a graphite rod, but it has a very parabolic bend to it. And again, when I use treble hooked baits, I like to have more of that moderate action, more of that parabolic bend that's going to allow you to keep a lot more of those fish hooked all the way to the boat and not lose a ton of fish. Now, I'm going to use typically 30-pound braid, and I will attach a very small leader to that spook. And to me, I'll use 20-pound monofilament most of the time. You can get away with fluorocarbon because the leader is literally this long. And the biggest reason that you have that leader is that when you make a long cast with the spook, that your braid doesn't wrap around the front treble hook and then you fouled up an entire cast. Having that mono or that fluoro that's a little bit more taut will prevent that. And so that is kind of my setup. The rod that I like is a 7-foot 2-inch, but I think anything between about 6'9" and about 7'2", 7'3" is gonna work really good as far as a topwater. Again, you want that parabolic bending action. All right, let's move on to the very next season. And I actually divided, so the next season is gonna be summertime, but I divided summer into two main parts. You have early summer and you have late summer. Now, the big thing with early summer and late summer is that my bait choices are just different because early summer bass are fairly aggressive, late summer bass are not aggressive. And so what happens a lot of times in early summer is you have a lot of these fish that have spawned in different areas of the lake, and they kind of make their way out to more main lake cover and structure, whether that's, cover might be a main lake brush pile or a main lake grass point. Structure might be a main lake ledge or a main lake hump, whatever it may be. But these fish, when they first get out to that area, they will hit a lot of moving baits, a lot of loud moving baits. And I kind of think that this is another theory that I have, but anytime you have bass go from one kind of general area to another general area, I think that they are more aggressive. That's why I think that part of the reason why pre-spawn bass are so aggressive, because they've been out deep, they move to shallow. And the reason that I think this is because growing up with that pond in my backyard, I caught a lot of fish in lakes and I brought them back to that pond. And almost every single time that I would catch a fish in a lake, bring it back, I would catch that exact same fish in that pond within a few days. Like, it happened so many times throughout just growing up that I took notice of it. And I was like, huh, that's really, really interesting. And I think the thing is that bass, when they get to a new environment or a new area, even if they've been there a long time ago, they kind of just like to sample. They kind of like to test things out. So I think that it makes them a little bit more aggressive. And when you have bass that are aggressive, big, loud, noisy lures are always good. So for me, one of my favorite early summer baits is a deep diving crankbait. I love a good deep diving crankbait. I also put in quotations like a swim bait. And so what I mean by that is that, you know, sometimes I like deep diving crankbaits and a little bit like not water clarity where you can see 10 feet. If you can see like 10, 12 foot, if it's really clear water, sometimes I'm going to opt for a swim bait that doesn't have as much rattle, but is still fairly big. So like this might be like a 6-inch Kitech style bait, really anything from 4.5 to 6 inch on the back of a big jig head, like a 1-ounce jig head. This might be like the new Bass Mafia swim bait. I got to use it a little bit this year, but I feel like I'm gonna use that a lot into next year. And you have a deeper version which gets down there a little bit. So in the really clear water, I tend to lean on the swim bait. In kind of more of your traditional water, or where you have 2, 3, 4, 5 foot of visibility, I'm gonna lean more on the deep diving crankbait. So when it comes to the structure that I'm fishing or cover, you know, this can be a little bit of anything. Typically it is main lake oriented stuff that is close to main river channels or main creek channels of some sort. This can also be points and structure that are within major creek arms. You know, as the bass kind of start to pull off, sometimes they'll stay in a major creek arm the entire year. Not all of your fish are gonna go out to the main body of water. And so anyways, I'm gonna use that crankbait, and a lot of times I'm ripping this thing. I am bringing it as fast as I can. Now the big thing with those early summer bass is I am going to look for schools of fish. So I tend to use my electronics a lot more during this time of the year. When I find those schools of fish, those two baits are going to be the first ones that I throw in there, and they're typically the ones that I also catch fish on. Now, as far as a deep diving crankbait, there is a rod made by Arc that is called the Launcher. It is a 7-foot, 10-inch rod. So it's a very long rod, which is why it's called the Launcher, but it is, again, it's a composite rod. It's a more parabolic bending rod. And so I really like that rod with a 6.3 to 1 gear ratio reel. Anything in the 6s is what I like. I used to fish a lot more 5s, but I can get away with the 6s, and I just prefer that because really a 5 gear ratio reel, you just can't do a whole lot. Like there's only a few things that you can really do, which is big deep diving crankbaits or baits like a big spinner bait. I like to have reels that I can use for a lot of different techniques so that I don't have to spend a lot of money. So anyway, something in the 6 gear ratio range, and usually 12 to 14 pound fluorocarbon line is what I'm looking at. So I'm gonna use 12 pound on smaller deep diving crankbaits like 5XDs or by Strike King Series 5s. I think Berkeley, I'm trying to think of the Dredger, like all the way up to usually like it's a 12.5 or 15 that I'll use that 12 pound line. If I go with those big deep diving crankbaits, the 6XDs, the bigger dredgers, whatever it may be, that's where I do like the 14 pound line, just because those baits are heavier, and if you're cranking around a lot of rock or shell or brush, if you use 12 pound line, you have to be very cautious of your line because you will go to cast those baits one time and that thing will, I mean, it will break off, and that's when a crankbait will go into orbit. Like I fear for people who are on the bank with a crankbait that's traveling at them like 200 miles an hour. But anyways, that's kind of my setup for crankbaits. When it comes to a swim bait, usually I have rods that I call offshore rods. And as a matter of fact, Arc has an offshore special is what they call it. It's a 7-foot, 6-inch medium heavy power, but it's a fast action. So I'm gonna use the fast action more on my single hooked baits like those swim baits that I talked about. And I'm gonna use anything, most of the time I'm using like 14 or 15 pound fluorocarbon in this situation. If it's really deep, you might need to use 12 pound, but you gotta be careful on the hook set. But if you're fishing shallow around big fish, you may even have to up it to 17. pound line, or even 20. So anyways, that's my setup for the swim bait rod during the early summer. Now let's talk about late summer. Late summer, like I said, is a time frame where bass have seen a lot. Not only are they seeing big crankbaits like I talked about, they're seeing big swim baits, they're seeing a lot of different bigger lures that have a ton of action and a ton of vibration to them. And in late summer, you tend to break up some of those main schools. The bass have kind of been there for a while. And so what I tend to use a lot is some sort of like Magnum shaky head style worm, or even a shaky head, like a finesse shaky head itself. I like baits that move very, very slow in late summer, and I'm gonna fish them in a lot of the exact same places where I fished for bass in the early summer, but again, these fish are just a lot more pressured, so sometimes you have to finesse them. Another bait that honestly I pick up a lot too is just a drop shot. You guys know that I love a drop shot. It's a bait that I pick up a ton. But a Magnum shaky head, if I can get away with the Magnum shaky head, throwing it on a bait cast rod, I'm gonna throw it on that 7-foot 6-inch offshore special that I just talked about, which is a medium heavy power fast action rod. And I'm gonna fish that on 14 or 15 pound line with usually an 8 gear ratio reel. Anything in the 8s. You can fish with a 7 if you wanted, but I like an 8 gear ratio reel whenever I'm fishing a bait where I'm dragging it, because I'm not using the reel to move the bait, I'm just using it to catch up on the slack. And so anyways, that becomes one of my favorite baits, some sort of Magnum shaky head type setup, or finesse gear a lot of times. So anyways, again, fishing in a lot of the exact same areas, points, ledges, brush piles, humps, whatever it may be, I'm just fishing it a lot slower to catch those fish. Now, let's talk about the fall time. And again, like summer, I broke fall into 2 main parts. You have the early fall and the late fall, because to me, they fish vastly different at times. And so the early fall to me is the toughest time of the year to catch a bass, or at least it was for a long time for me. Kind of that summer, what happens a lot of times is you're going from a summer to fall transition during this time. So you'll have these cool nights, but you'll have these warm days, and it just throws the fish off. You have a fall turnover that can happen in lakes. And I've talked about this. I felt like I talked about it endlessly this past fall, but my favorite thing to do is to go down the bank with a topwater bait. Specifically, I like to fish a plopper during the fall turnover, and I am just fishing shallow water. There are fish that are gonna remain deep during this time of the year, and you can find schools of fish, but to me, the best way to catch them is just to burn the bank. Burn the bank, and you are catching fish on a little bit of everything. You're catching them around, you know, a riprap bank. Then you'll fish that plopper down a dock and catch one. You'll fish it by a grass clump and catch one. You'll fish it down a lay down and catch one. I fish a little bit of everything during this time of year. The main focus is covering water with a plopper. To me, that is one of the best ways to catch some big fish in that time frame, and it's very easy to do. You don't need electronics. You just pick that plopper up and cast it and go. And so that is one of my favorite things to do. It's something that I found to be effective on a number of different bodies of water. The biggest thing that you want to take in consideration with a plopper is the size of the bait. Sometimes it seems like the bass really like those big ones, the 110s, the 130s, and sometimes they like the small ones, the Whopper Plopper 90s, or they even make a 75, I think it is. So anyways, sometimes they like the big, sometimes they like the small. That's one of the biggest things. Now, when it comes to the equipment that I'm going to fish that plopper on, I fish it on my chatterbait rod, but I fish it with braided line. So again, it's a treble hooked bait. I like moderate bending rods. And so because I'm not constantly working a plopper, it's more or less just reeling it in, I can get away with a rod that's a composite rod because it's a little bit heavier, if that makes sense. The rod is a little bit heavier, but because it's heavier, this is why I don't like to have, I should have said this earlier, but the reason I don't like to have a composite rod when I fish baits like a spook style bait, a walking bait, is because you're constantly working it. And a composite rod tends to be heavier than a straight graphite rod. And so it can just wear down your hand after doing it for a whole day. When you're fishing a topwater bait like a plopper, you're not working that bait. You're more or less just reeling the bait. And so anyways, that's why I like that composite rod with treble hooks, but I do use braided line. Typically 30 or 40 pound braid is what I'm going to use. And again, you're fishing it all over the place, and this is straight braid. And it's a great way to catch them. It can be hard to do that though, to just constantly cover water and not kind of try to, it's just that bass can be everywhere during the early fall. They truly can. They can be deep, they can be shallow. And so sometimes it's not about patterning the fish. It's more or less about just running into one fish here and there, okay? So, all right, let's talk about the late fall. The late fall is a little bit similar to early fall in my bait choice, which actually is going to be a buzz bait. A buzz bait to me is a bait. I fish a lot of topwaters. As a matter of fact, if you look at my list here, I have 3 or 4 topwaters on them. I love topwater baits, and they catch big ones, and I love them. But a buzz bait is a great late fall bait. When your water temps are in the 50s all the way down into the upper 40s, a buzz bait can be a great bait to catch the biggest bass in the lake. Now, other baits, for example, like crankbaits, a little square lip crankbait can be better baits to catch more fish, but usually when I go out, I'm trying to catch big ones. And so anyways, a buzzbait is a great bait. A lot of times I'm going to fish it around visible cover that I can see with my own eyes. The thing about late fall is that you do tend to have fish that group up. So instead of having fish that are one here, one there, like early fall, these fish start to kind of settle into areas that they want to be in. And so you might find that, you know, creek channel swing banks, the last creek channel swing bank before the end of the pocket is where that fish are. Maybe they're in the back of the pocket, and that's where you're catching them, those fish on a buzzbait. So the big thing that's different is, one, I like the buzzbait over the plopper because the plopper is a loud, aggressive bait, and when you get colder water, I like more subtle baits, which is why I like the buzzbait. But I'm going to fish it and pay attention to where I'm getting bit, because then you can start to run a pattern, which you really weren't able to do in the early fall. So that's one of the biggest things. When it comes to a buzzbait, there is a rod that is the Arc Cobb Series rod. It is a 7-foot 1-inch rod, medium heavy power, and it's more of a fast action, but it has a decent amount of bend to it. And I will fish it on 30 or 40 pound straight braid. That is a really good setup for me. Usually something like a 7.1-to-1 gear ratio reel, which is the same type of reel that I would use on my plopper. I don't think I mentioned that. So anyways, that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to fish a buzzbait a lot, and I'm going to fish it until the water gets very, very cold. Now, when the water starts to dip below, you know, really when it starts to dip below 50s, when it's anywhere in the 30s and 40s, one of your best friends as far as a bait goes tends to be really finesse baits. Now, if you're fishing out of a boat and have forward-facing sonar, I'm going to tell you a jig head minnow. If you're fishing out of a boat without forward-facing sonar, or you're fishing from the bank, I'm going to tell you to fish like a shaky head. To me, a shaky head is a very, very good bait that you can fish a little bit everywhere. It gets bit in really, really cold water. A jig head minnow, if you have forward-facing sonar, you can more or less scope out fish. You can see them relating to the bottom sometimes, relating to the bait sometimes. So anyways, that's pretty much it. I think that I've covered all the equipment when it comes to a shaky head and a jig head minnow is pretty much the same for me. I like a 7-foot 1-inch rod, usually a medium power and kind of a fast action. I will fish 10-pound braid to a 8 or 10-pound fluorocarbon leader with a shaky head. With the jig head minnow, I like 12-pound fluorocarbon. So anyways, I think that's it. This has been a pretty long video, but I hope that it really just gives you confidence in one bait per season that you guys go through. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check out Fin Fishing, and I will see you guys in the next one.